Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Craig Davis, Director of Adult Services, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's virtual program is another in our ongoing series of literary, cultural, and civic programming. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Tonight, it is my very great pleasure to welcome two distinguished guests, author Jill Wine and Christie Hefner, here to discuss Jill's recent book titled The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President. In regard to the story set within The Watergate Girl, it was a time, much like today, when Americans feared for the future of their democracy and women stood up for equal treatment. At the crossroads of the Watergate scandal and the women's movement stood a young lawyer named Jill Wine Volner, as she was then known, barely 30 years old, and the only woman on the team that prosecuted the highest-ranking White House officials. Called the mini-skirted lawyer by the press, she fought to receive the respect accorded her male counterparts, and she prevailed. In The Watergate Girl, Jill Wine takes us inside this troubled time in American history, and it is impossible to read about the crimes of Richard Nixon and the people around him without drawing parallels to today's recent headlines. The book is also a story of a young woman who sought to make her professional mark while trapped in a failing marriage, buffeted by sexist preconceptions and harboring secrets of her own. Her house was burgled, her phones were tapped, and even her office garbage was rifled through. At once a cautionary tale and an inspiration for those who believe in the power of justice and the rule of law, The Watergate Girl is a revelation about our country, our politics, and who we are as a society. Jill Wine is an MSNBC legal analyst appearing regularly on the network's primetime and daytime shows. She began her career as an organized crime prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, which led to her selection as one of the 3 assistant Watergate special prosecutors in the obstruction of justice trial against President Nixon's top aides. She has also served as General Counsel of the U.S. Army, Solicitor General and Deputy Attorney General of the state of Illinois, and Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Bar Association. In each case, she was the first woman to hold the position. She has a BS in Communications from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, a JD from Columbia University School of Law in New York City, and an honorary Doctor of Law from Hood College. And we're very happy that she lives in Chicago. Appearing with Jill is Christie Hefner, and I couldn't be more pleased. Christie grew up and has lived virtually her entire life in Chicago. She is active in the community, serving on the Civic Advisory Committee of the Better Government Association and on the Board of Trustees of Rush University Medical Center. She chaired the campaign to raise funds to build the CORE Center, a national model for the treatment of people with HIV/AIDS, and co-chaired the Capital campaign to build the first permanent theater for the Black Ensemble Theater. She served as chairman, CEO of Playboy Enterprises for 20 years, making her the longest serving female CEO of a publicly traded company. While there, she led the transformation of the company from a domestic magazine-focused business to an international brand-driven multimedia company, and was named to Fortune's most powerful women in the world. When she left, over 40% of her executives were women, and she has long worked to advance women, including being a co-founder of the Chicago Network and the Chicago chapter of Women Corporate Directors. Today, she serves as a director and/or strategic advisor to companies and industries in fields such as media, cannabis, beauty, and technology. She and Jill are longtime friends, and she is a longtime friend of the library, and I consider her a friend, so this is quite an honor. She has led many conversations with a number of authors here at the library. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jill Wine and Christie Hefner.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you and the library for hosting us tonight. It is always a special treat to be able to be a part of a program that is sponsored by the library and enhances the library's reputation for bringing thoughtful leaders and speakers to our community. So let's get started. Jill, your book has been called an engrossing memoir of the times that were gender challenged. I'd love it for you to take us through your journey and what it was like to be one of only 15 women in that Columbia Law School class of 300, and how you wound up as the only female trial lawyer during Watergate.
I'll start with your last question because that's the easiest to answer. And that is, how did I end up being the only one? It's because there were no other women in trial practice. There just was no other candidate. I don't think I ended up there because I was a woman. I had been trying cases in the Department of Justice organized crime section. And so I was, I hope, a experienced trial attorney, albeit I was only a few years out of law school. So how experienced could I have been? But really the entire team was young. Richard Benveniste was only a year ahead of me in law school, but he had 2 years ahead of me in experience. He had an extra year of trial experience because I did encounter sexism when I got there. I was hired as a trial attorney at the department, but I was handling appeals. All lawyers at the organized crime section start in appeals, but then they move on to trials. And I didn't realize until I'd been there a year that the men had moved on and I hadn't. And I had no female colleagues to talk to. So I figured I just had to go to the boss. And I went to the boss and said, how come I'm not trying cases? And he said, well, because you're a girl and you'd be much more vulnerable in a courtroom. In appeals, it's just lawyers. But in a courtroom, you'd be with made members of the mob. And I said, well, you hired me as a trial attorney. I expect a trial. And that's how I got my first trial, was finally realizing I had been discriminated against.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to law school, if I had realized that there was a 5% quota of women in the class,
There was really a quota.
There was 5%
Wow.
African American, 5% female. And of course, Columbia denies that it was a quota, but it's very strange that there were 5% of both categories, and that was it. The women obviously had very high LSAT scores and high GPAs, because if you're only picking a few women, you can really be selective. But when I got there, it was far more discrimination than I had ever experienced. And the reason I was in law school was because discrimination in journalism was such that I was offered jobs on the woman's page.
Because that was your first love, was journalism, right?
Yes, my undergraduate degree is journalism, and that's what I wanted to be. But I wanted to cover hard news. I wanted to cover courts or foreign affairs, not women's affairs. And so I thought if I went to law school, an editor would take me more seriously and I'd get a better journalism job. I did not go with the intention of being a lawyer. Then when I got there, my classmates would say, you're taking the place of a man who's going to die in Vietnam because you took his rightful place, and you'll never practice law, so you shouldn't be here. In job interviews, I was asked what kind of birth control I used, how many children I planned to have, what I would do if I was having a dinner party and a client had an emergency. Questions that no man would be asked, but which were not illegal back then. There was no EEOC, there was no protection. And if you didn't answer the questions in an acceptable way, you wouldn't get a job. So women were forced to make a choice. You either get a job by answering those questions, offensive as they may be, or you tell them what you think of the questions and you're unemployed.
It really sounds like it hadn't changed that much from what we all learned from the documentary and the feature film of the times when Ruth Bader Ginsburg got out of law school.
She's a generation ahead of me, maybe not even a full generation, but at least
Right.
10 years
But
ahead
it
of me.
doesn't sound like it was that different.
Well, the difference was that I could get interviews, and if I answered the questions appropriately, I could get a job. Remember, she was top of her class,
Right.
and she couldn't get a job.
Couldn't even
Sandra
get
Day
a,
O'Connor ended up being a receptionist
right.
after she graduated from law school. So there was a slight improvement,
Okay.
but think about what it was like to join a firm where you had to answer questions like that and what your prospects for success were. I did accept a job on Wall Street because it was the easy thing to do. Law firms came to Columbia to interview students, and then you went downtown to meet people at the firm. I had no interest really in Wall Street practice, but it seemed like the thing to do, and so I accepted a job. Luckily, my then husband decided he wanted to practice in Washington. He wanted to go to a government agency and said, "We're moving." And so I told the firm, "Oh, I'm not going to start." And then I had to look for a job in Washington where I had no connections, but had the networking skills and ended up getting connected to this really great job that opened my eyes to how great practicing law could be, which was at the Department of Justice and doing trials.
So you explained how early on you weren't even being considered to do trial work because you were female, and you asserted yourself and obviously established a distinguished career in convicting people in organized crime. And then you wind up as a trial lawyer in Watergate. And unquestionably, not just in your story, but in the entire story of Watergate, one of the seminal moments is the cross-examination of Rosemary Woods, President Nixon's longtime and very loyal secretary, executive assistant. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that was like and what your strategy was going into that encounter and how it played out. And then, because I know from the book, you are more sympathetic in the writing of the book towards her than one might expect. I'd love for you to talk about how the writing of the book caused you to reflect on her life and your own life and what conclusions you drew.
So let me start with putting in context. And I've already told how I had to confront the boss to say, "You hired me as a trial lawyer, I want a trial." During the Watergate investigation, and this was still in the investigation stages, when we found out about the tapes and subpoenaed them, we finally won in court, and the president was forced by public opinion to retract what he had said, which is, "You'll never get the tapes," to saying, "Okay, I'm going to appoint a new special prosecutor," having fired Archibald Cox in the Saturday Night Massacre, "and I'll give you the tapes." And then a few weeks later, he went, "Well, except for two that are missing." And it was in that hearing about what had caused those tapes to go missing that I said to my then only colleague, because the senior person on the team had returned to Nashville to tend to his private practice, leaving Rick and Richard Benvenista and myself in charge. And I called Rick out and said, "You're taking too many witnesses. I'm going to take the next witness the White House calls, and then we're sharing equally." So I'd learned my lesson at the Department of Justice. I didn't wait a year. I waited a day and said, "Okay, we're sharing." And the next witness called was Rosemary Woods. In that first hearing, she was a very minor witness. But a few weeks later, they called us back to court and said, "Oh, well, we just discovered a third one that has a problem, and it has an 18.5-minute gap that only Rosemary Woods can explain. There's no innocent explanation that we can come up with." So there I was. I had questioned her. She was going to be my witness again. I found this out the day before Thanksgiving, so Wednesday. The tapes hearing was going to resume on Monday, and I was going to have to violate the very most basic principle of cross-examination: never ask a question you don't know the answer to. I was going to have to say, "Tell me what happened. How is this 18-minute gap there?" And I had no idea what she would say. So I prepared as best I could by reading her prior testimony, which proved to have a great question in it that I had asked. Very luckily, I had asked her what steps she had taken to prevent erasing anything on the tapes that she handled. And she had yelled at me in a very sneering tone, "I used my head. It's the only thing I had to use," which came back to haunt her when it turned out that she had actually erased 18 minutes of tape. So we go to court, and I had a Perry Mason moment. Perry Mason, every night on television in the old days, would have someone on the stand saying, "I did it. It's not your client." Well, that doesn't happen in real life, but it happened to me because after I asked her to explain, she gave a really weird sounding explanation about pushing the wrong button on the tape machine, keeping her foot on the pedal, and reaching for a phone more than 6 feet away from her. And I just thought, this doesn't sound right. So I said to the White House, let's bring the equipment here so she can demonstrate in court. And courtroom demonstrations are frowned on in federal court, but Judge Sirica allowed it, and the White House didn't object, and her lawyer didn't object. So we brought the equipment in, set it up, and as she was going to demonstrate, she had on headphones, which was part of her gear. And I asked her the first question, and she lifted the earphone and said, "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you." So I said, "Well, maybe you should take the headphones off so you can hear my questions." She put them on the witness box ledge, which is inches away from her. I asked my next question, and she said, "Well, first I had to," and she gently pointed toward the headphones. "I had to take those off, and with the slightest movement of her hand, her foot came off the pedal, and the reel-to-reel tape stopped. It was visible to everyone in the courtroom, especially me. I shrieked, 'And your foot's off the pedal and it's not erasing.' The courtroom cleared with all the press going to a bank of payphones in days before there were cell phones to call in the story. And I felt like I was in a movie. And she said, 'Well, it's different in my office. I did it there.' And without missing a beat, I said, 'Well, then maybe we should adjourn to your office.' And again, no one objected. And so for the first time in my life, I was off to the White House, but not just to the public rooms of the White House. I was off to be
The Oval
adjacent
Office.
to the Oval Office. And they would not let us bring a photographer with, so we had to use the White House photographer. And the pictures became front page news on every newspaper. In those days, we had a lot of weekly magazines. It was the front page of every magazine cover because it showed her in what was known as the Rosemary Stretch. And there's a great picture of that from the evidence in the book. And it became apparent to everyone that she was lying, that it didn't happen the way she said, that it could not possibly have happened that way. And it was really a pivotal moment in the Watergate case because it was one of the first times that the American people went, "Oh, the president could be a crook.
Maybe they're not all telling the truth."
Maybe this is a lie. Maybe there's obstruction of justice. How did this get erased? So it was a very, very major moment. It was obviously major in my career and also in my personal life because the picture that appeared of me in the paper was seen by my high school boyfriend, who is now my husband of 41 years. So we re-met through that event. So it was a major thing in my life.
And talk a little bit about what you came to think about Rosemary Woods, because I know you tried to get to understand her when you were writing the book.
When I started out in my head, I wanted to portray her as a real person because I was a real person cross-examining her. And it just seemed unbalanced if a major part of my part in this trial was me questioning an anonymous cartoon character. And Herb Block, who was syndicated here in Chicago, had some great
Political cartoonist.
Political cartoonist. Had great cartoons of her. And I wanted her to be a real person. So I tried getting to talk to people who knew her, people who knew where she shopped, who her friends were, what her hobbies were, what her apartment looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And they would all hang up on me. I eventually met Bob Woodward, who said, "Stop calling. It's too easy to hang up on you. You have to knock on the door." So I flew to Washington, knocked on a door, and it got slammed in my face. So I gave up on trying to portray her through the words of her friends and just did as much research as I could and got little tidbits. I talked a lot to John Dean, and I asked him, "You've been in her apartment. What did it look like?" I never really noticed because he's a man and men don't notice those things, I guess. But he did say, I really didn't talk to her much. After I would say, "Good morning, Rose," I would go right into the Oval Office. And so I didn't really have a conversation with her. I said, "Wait, what? She's called Rose?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, everybody called her Rose."
Mm.
So I had been calling her Rosemary because that was her name, but apparently she was known as Rose. I will add that maybe I will write another chapter or second edition someday, because after the book was published and I was on my very abbreviated book tour interrupted by COVID, and my book came out February 25th. So figure out, how long my book tour lasted. But on a radio show, Fresh Air on NPR, I mentioned this story about wanting to portray her and being stymied in that. And I got a call from her grandnephew who said he would be happy to talk to me. And I've had a lovely series of conversations with him and feel I know her better. I also listened to tape recordings that were not part of our trial, but were just conversations between President Nixon and Rosemary Woods. And it is clear to me that she was an advisor to him. She was not just someone who took dictation and typed up what he said. She was
More
very
chief of
much.
staff.
She would have been in a different generation. She would have been the chief of staff. She is, just to give an example, when the Republicans came to him and said, "If you don't resign, you will be convicted on the charges of impeachment," he went to Rosemary Woods and said, "I can't tell my wife and daughters, you have to do it."
Mm.
So he told her, and she's the one who informed them that he was announcing his resignation the next day and that they would be leaving the White House. So that shows you something about the relationship that they had,
Yeah.
and why I say that she would have had a much more prominent role.
So let's jump a number of decades to contemporary times. As Craig said in his introduction, part of what makes the story of Watergate so resonant today is because of what we all lived through in the impeachment efforts against President Trump and in the reaction of the press, the Republican Party, the courts, all of our institutions to what was going on. I know in your epilogue, you write, Jill, about how you felt that what was going on in the Trump administration was, in your words, even a deeper existential threat than Watergate. I'd love to get your perspective on, just as a lawyer, the efforts on impeachment, what you thought of them strategically. And then I'd love to talk a little bit about how you would compare and contrast what was happening in these recent times with what was happening back in the early 70s.
That's a great question. I do want to point out that my book is really focused on Watergate, and that I do not mention Donald Trump until the epilogue, and only because the parallels are so obvious that you can't avoid.
Well, it would have been conspicuous by its absence.
It would have been. And so, I have an epilogue to cover basically 40 years of my life, whereas the book covers, the whole book is 1.5 years. So there's a lot condensed in that 40 pages. Maybe grounds for a second book to fill that out. But the reason that I say that is the Nixon presidency had more than just Watergate. I mean, I don't want to limit it to Watergate. There was the Ellsberg break-in to his psychiatrist's office. There was the enemies list and people targeted for IRS audits who Nixon thought wrote bad things about him in the press. So there were other abuses.
I have to interject that my father was extremely proud of being on the Nixon's enemies list.
I don't blame him. That is something to be proud of. There was only one woman on the list, and it was Mary McGrory, who was a reporter for the Washington Star. So there were multiple things, but basically, Richard Nixon believed in democracy, he believed in government, and he felt a sense of shame. And the reason that I think that it was worse in the Trump administration is that he got away with everything and he had no sense of shame. He gets caught in a lie and he repeats the lie. And the number of episodes that I consider to be scandalous or criminal, and I'll distinguish them. There are some things that are awful, but they're not unlawful. And then there are things that are out and out crimes, or things that are, a violation of constitutional principles, but there's no punishment for them, like violating the emoluments clause.
Mhm.
And so I
Explain
think
what the emoluments clause is briefly.
the emoluments clause basically says that the president and other high-level officers cannot benefit from being in office. They
Be
cannot
self-enriched.
Yes, they cannot enrich themselves. And he, in the case of Donald Trump, he clearly was. But the case got delayed so long that by the time it got to the Supreme Court, they said, well, it's moot. He's out of office, so he's not violating it anymore. That's a very unsatisfactory answer to me, who believes in justice. I think, Watergate, I just want to point out, democracy worked, justice prevailed. There was bipartisan support for the articles of impeachment, for his leaving office. He wasn't impeached by the Senate because he resigned rather than face the trial that would have been a sure conviction. Facts were accepted as true. There was no debate. There wasn't the social media and general media landscape. There was no Fox News. I often think that if there had been a Fox News, Richard Nixon would not have been ousted from office. He would have stayed. People there were basically three networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, and they all had the same facts. There was different opinions based on those facts, but nobody debated the existence of truth. And that's something that is so very much missing now and leads to some of the problems that we're having. You have a recount in Arizona that's based on a total fabricated story about there being fraud. Everybody who has looked at the facts, the evidence, says no fraud. But you ask people who support Donald Trump and they say, well, it's fraudulent because he says it is, which is, to me, nonsensical. But that's why I think it was much worse. And there was interference not just with the criminal investigation or the impeachment investigation, but with general oversight. Our constitutional framework says that Congress has a right to oversee certain things. Well, that requires that someone produce documents, that someone come and testify. And when they were looking at things like the family separation at the border, Trump said, I'm not sending anybody in to testify. And he never did. And so if you don't have congressional oversight, you've completely eviscerated our constitutional framework. And so that's why I think it was more dangerous.
But wouldn't you say there's been, maybe it culminated with Trump, but it didn't start with Trump, a kind of creeping growth in executive power and therefore a lack of balance in the checks and balances between the legislative branch and the executive branch?
Yes, to some extent, but not to a unworkable extent. Other presidents have cooperated far more than Donald Trump did. And I think that he brought it to a level where it became a real danger to democracy, as opposed to just a partisan fight. And so I think it is, I do think it was a very different set of circumstances. And it shows that there are things in our legal system, our Constitution, and our laws that are based on the assumption that people will obey the laws and that they won't just feel confident in totally ignoring the rules. Whereas Donald Trump has felt that he could just ignore the rules and get away with it. And so he wasn't embarrassed to be caught. And there were certain things, for example, it's for recent history has all presidents have shown their tax returns. And he refused to on a phony assumption. He also made claims of things like not just executive privilege, which is a legitimate privilege, but he claimed total immunity. I'm totally immune from any criminal investigation. If I shot someone on Fifth Avenue, the police could not investigate it. That's an absurd, made up, non existent thing. And I think if we go back to Nixon and he had been prosecuted instead of just resigning, that maybe there would have been a stronger message to this president, to the former president, and maybe he would have not done some of the things he did because he knew there might be consequences.
So to your point about, kind of our reliance on the rule of law and people's willingness to abide by the law, we also obviously, as a functioning democracy, are very dependent on the courts. And President Biden has just put in place a panel to look at potential reforms of the Supreme Court. Obviously, the Supreme Court played a critical role in Watergate. But as someone who's been head of the ABA and who's been Solicitor General in the state of Illinois and a prosecutor, what are your thoughts about the institution of the Supreme Court and any reforms that, if you were on that panel, you'd be advocating for?
Well, I will be very interested in the information they develop. I have had a shifting position on this, starting with, if you expand it and the Republicans take over, they'll just expand it more, and eventually you'll have an untenable number of people.
Dysfunctional. Yeah.
It won't work. To going, well, they stole a bunch of seats. They were absurd in their behavior, and we have to balance it out now. To going back more moderate, thinking, I'll be interested to see what the options are that they come up with on this panel to see how we can do this. I think ultimately the court structure needs to be revised. I don't think packing the court is going to be politically acceptable. So maybe it's something like we stop appointing for lifetime tenure and we start appointing for 18 years, some
specific term limits.
Specific term with it timed so that every president gets to appoint a member of the court or more members. Obviously, there will be resignations or deaths that occur, and so that someone may get an out-of-turn appointment.
But not the lopsidedness that there is now.
Exactly. And I think things like saying, well, we can't consider this nominee because it's the year of an election. It's 9 months before the election. The president is the president until the day the new president is, to the minute the president is sworn in, and cannot be deprived of his powers, including appointing to the Supreme Court, for that reason. That was an absurd reason. And there's a part of me that wants to punish them for that. But I think ultimately that's probably a bad idea.
So you made passing reference to, in a sequel, you might write about other things, but what about the potential of this book being turned into a movie?
It's quite remarkable and extraordinary. I mean, it's almost embarrassing that.
Do share.
Yes, the book has been optioned by Katie Holmes, and she wants to produce and play me. She wants to produce the movie, but she also wants to play me. And I've had wonderful conversations with her. She's very smart. And I've watched every movie she made, and she's a very good actor. I have loved from her early movies like Ice Storm and Wonder Boys to very recent ones. She played Jackie Kennedy in a television series that was—
That's right, I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
Was very good in that. And so it's just very exciting. She's interviewing screenwriters right now to convert the book into a screenplay. And I'm hopeful that it will get made. I know that not just COVID, but statistics are that not all books that get optioned get made. But she's moving ahead with lightning speed. And so I am hoping that someday we'll be able to go to a movie theater and enjoy seeing it on screen. Although that reminds me of my husband and I were at the movies in days when we used to go to the movies, and Fahrenheit 9/11 had just come out. And it's a Michael Moore movie, and we're watching it. And at the end of the movie, I'm going like, oh my God, I'm in that movie. There is,
Really?
yes, I
In
am.
what way?
It's commentary I was doing on MSNBC.
Huh.
I hadn't, I mean, obviously they didn't ask my permission. I don't know if they asked MSNBC. It may be fair use, but it's the strangest thing to be sitting in a theater and you're on that full big screen. So yes, so that was weird.
Well, but you know, when the movie is made, they will reissue the book and it will say now a major motion picture.
Yes.
And then Craig will invite you and Katie Holmes to be on the stage to talk.
Craig, we accept. We'll be back. And by then it will be in person, which
Right.
I'm so sorry that this isn't in person. I am a lover of the library. The pin I'm wearing today is library books. And I'm honoring the library because it has always been wonderful. So hopefully they will
So
have it back.
a couple of times we've talked about MSNBC and, you know, the sort of other parts of your very distinguished career post Watergate, and most recently with the outstanding commentary that you've been providing on MSNBC. But I want to drill down on another part of your biography that intersects with a very timely issue, and that's the issue of assault in the military. So we're debating right now about what to do about it. There's been some recommendations, but I'd love your perspective on that, given that you were the general counsel to the Secretary of the Army, you have been a prosecutor, and that you served on a fairly recent panel to look into this matter and make recommendations to the Department of Defense. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about this issue, because I think that there are a lot of us that are concerned about the seeming crisis in the armed services and what is best to do about it.
It's a complex question, and I want to put it in context. I was privileged to serve on a commission looking at sexual assault in the military during the Obama administration. And I have just talked to one of the members of the commission that Secretary of Defense Austin appointed and gave 90 days, which is really fast, but that's typical military, gave 90 days for them to come up with recommendations. And the leaked information is that they are recommending a change in how sexual assault cases are reported, which is they want to take it out of the chain of command. And let me just say that when we looked at it, the Pentagon was not willing to even let us talk about that. That was not on our.
And you should say when this was, because this was not like 15 years ago.
No, this was, I mean, it ended with the Obama administration. We ended really just after the inauguration. So 2017 was when we went out of business, issued our final report. So it's only a few years ago. I learned a great deal. Number one, we have to keep in mind that the population in the military skews very young, 17 to 24. And that is a prime target for sexual assault. So if you compare the numbers in the military to what's happening in colleges, for example, with a similar age demographic, it's not so outrageous. It may be compounded because of the living and working conditions in the military, but it was, when we started, generals were thought to be impeding investigations. In the several years that I was studying this, and we had public hearings, we traveled abroad to go to different air bases and Army bases. This was an all military look, not just the Army. We went on ships. And what we found was that the public pressure on generals, commanding officers, not necessarily a general, but the highest ranking person in the chain of command for a particular unit, were so pressured that they basically were saying, prosecute anything that gets reported, which meant that the staff judge advocate would say, this is a really bad case. There's no corroborating evidence. No jury is going to convict on this. And sure enough, the acquittal rate skyrocketed because the cases were just not appealing. So
Not strong enough.
they weren't strong cases, and generals were caving into the pressure. So I came away from our panel saying, it's not so bad that they're in charge because
If anything, they're
overreacting and they're bending over backwards. However, I think that the more we now see and the numbers that we're seeing, there has been no diminution in the number, despite the training that is drilled into soldiers, sailors, and airmen, despite prosecutions, the numbers haven't declined. And there is more and more evidence that victims, and when I say victims, there are more men in the Army than there are women. So even though statistically, percentage-wise, a woman is more likely to be attacked, more men, in fact, are numerically. So numerically, there are men. Statistically, you have a higher percentage chance of being attacked if you're a female. And so I think that if women remain afraid to report it because it's their commanding officer, that we have to take it out of the chain of command. But I want to see the evidence that this group has come up with that would support that. I learned a lot in the military. I grew up in the Vietnam War era as being anti-military, but took the job in the Pentagon because the issues were so interesting, and because it was a time when women were being integrated into basic training and the service academies. And I just thought there was a lot of opportunity to do good in the Pentagon. And I came to respect the people in the Pentagon as really smart, educated generals. All have at least one master's. Most of them have multiple PhDs. They're very smart, very organized, very good people. And so I came to respect the chain of command. Mm-hmm. But I think that there may be an issue, and part of the issue is peer pressure. Anybody who wants to report a sexual assault is going to be subjected to peers saying, you can't do that to your fellow soldier, your fellow airman, whatever. And so I think there are a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. And consent and the definition of consent is the biggest legal issue facing military sexual assault cases.
It's facing that's not limited to the military. That issue is an issue whether it's on college campuses or in the workplace or anywhere.
But the military had a particularly onus burden, which said one drink and you cannot consent. Now that's ridiculous. People have one drink and still can say no, and they can still say yes. So I think there needs to be some very clear definition of that.
Mm-hmm. Craig, maybe you want to open it up to some of the questions from the audience?
Yes, I have a few questions here. I have some specific questions for Jill, and then I have a question for both of you.
Okay.
So I have 4 for Jill, and then I'll go to the one where both of you can respond.
Okay.
Jill, do you have any, other than the ones you've mentioned, do you have any particular interesting memories of some of the prominent participants from that time, like Senator Sam Ervin? You've mentioned John Dean. Were there others who made an impression? Is there something you can tell us that we might not know about some of those great characters that we all remember from those hearings during that time?
Oh, I mean, if we had 3 hours, I could start with stories. There is not and people frequently ask, did I keep notes, contemporaneous notes? And I did not. The book is written from my memory, but I also had the benefit of Google and fact checking and a fact checker. And I did talk to some of the participants, including John Dean, Alex Butterfield, Stephen Bull, and of course my partners on the Watergate case. So it was enriched by that. But I have so many memories of, how Martha Mitchell was in the courtroom, how Ehrlichman.
Well, don't just leave us hanging.
Well,
How was she in
I
the
actually
courtroom?
think, as I said that, I think that I might have mentioned that in the book, where at the end of the trial, and they were estranged by then, but she faithfully came every day. And of course, the only people I saw in the bathroom in breaks was the wives of defendants. I wasn't seeing any other lawyers. I was seeing them. But she went up to him to console him, and he basically slapped her. And I'm sure it was out of, oh my God, I'm going to jail. But it was quite dramatic thing to see. I remember an episode with John Dean, which I don't think is in the book, where after he was cross-examined for the first time in our trial, he was really getting walloped. And I felt like, oh, this is awful. And his wife was sitting in the courtroom, and just as she did at the Senate, where she was this very ice queen figure, is how
Stoic.
she was described. Beautiful, beautiful woman. And he got off the stand and was walking toward her. And I just said, he wants a hug. Please hug him. And she froze, and she just stood with her arms stiffly at her side. And I really my heart broke for him, because he needed a hug. He really did. And so there were things like that I noticed. And, some of the people, like Woodward, I did not know Woodward and Bernstein at the time. We did not talk to them. I only met him. I was on the board of Roosevelt University, and he was a speaker, and I got to meet him at that event, and we actually became friends. And I visited him at his home in Washington, and as I said, he gave me advice on knocking on doors, which didn't help. But he also gave me a great story that he couldn't use. It was something he had discovered during his Watergate coverage, but he couldn't confirm it, and he passed it on to me, and I was able to confirm it and use it. So that was very wonderful. But yeah, they are all such colorful characters. I mean, if you were writing a novel, could you invent anybody more colorful than Gordon Liddy or Howard Hunt? And there's a great story of Howard Hunt in our office. One of the people who wasn't a prosecutor but was helping from Harvard, had come with Archie Cox, called him into his office and said, "I want to know how you do a black ops operation. How do you do this?" And so Hunt says, "Well, I'll tell you, it's really easy. When you want to break in, you get the very best cameras you can get, but you have to have a Polaroid in addition. And when you first enter the office, you take a Polaroid, because you want to look at it and make sure that when you leave, it looks exactly like that Polaroid picture. And the same thing's true with every drawer you open. You take a Polaroid so that when you close it, you make sure everything's back the same way." And he said, so, he's describing all this, and he says, and then you very carefully leave. And he walks out of the office, and he's under arrest. I mean, he's in martial custody at this point. And he walks out of the office and walks out of our offices and leaves. And, my colleague is waiting for him to come back. He's waiting, he's watching his watch. And finally he says, "Marshals, Hunt is missing." And Hunt had actually left the building. Now I don't think he thought he was getting away anywhere, but
Taking a
he did
stroll.
have to be rounded up and brought back in. So, there were just episodes like that, or being with John Dean when we found out about the fact that there were tapes, that Butterfield had just testified there were tapes, and how we all felt at that very moment. And actually John was relieved, because he said, "It will prove I'm telling the truth." And of course it did.
Well, it's funny, because the next question I had, I'm going to read it to you, even though you've sort of addressed some of it. What role, if any, did Attorney General John Mitchell's wife, Martha Mitchell, play, and did you ever meet her? So it's funny that you have already been able to mention her, because
Yeah,
she was quite a memorable character
she
from that
really
whole
was.
period.
And she was right after the trial, the Gridiron Club, which was at that time an all-male journalist organization. Um, there was a final decision that if they wouldn't take women, that a lot of the prominent people in Washington and a lot of the journalists wouldn't attend the Gridiron annual dinner, and that there would be a carnival instead. And at that carnival, Martha Mitchell was selling phone calls because she was known for calling strange people in the middle of the night. And this was obviously for charity for women journalists. And you would pay her, and she would call and say, "Hi, this is Martha Mitchell," and she would talk to whoever you wanted her to call. Um, Dan Rather and I were selling kisses. Elliot Richardson was selling doodles, which I bought and still have. Um, but when I asked him to sign it to me personally, you paid a little extra and you handed him a note with your name. He stopped, he looked up, he says, "Oh, I know you. I lost my job because of you." So there's some great stories.
Wow. Um, Jill, I just have to say, one of our librarians commented that she really loves the pin that you highlighted earlier. So thank you for pointing that out to all of us book
I
lovers.
will. I'll post a picture of it so you can see it a little more clearly.
Wonderful. In regard to the film, will you, like some of the other great writers or directors, like Alfred Hitchcock himself, make a cameo appearance in the film?
Oh, that would be very cool.
I certainly hope so. But the thing is, there aren't very many women unless I play one of the wives sitting in the courtroom. I don't know what role I could possibly play. Maybe I could be a stenographer. Maybe I'll
There
be
you
a
go.
steno.
I like that.
I would love to do that. Part of the deal is that I will be a producer, and I will cooperate in the screenplay writing as well. And so there's just, it's going to be a whole new full-time job to work on that.
Wow. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
I have one more question. This is a little more serious question, and it's for both you, Jill, and you, Christie. Both of you might be called pioneering women in your respective careers. What was the most difficult or even sexist obstacle you faced, and how did you manage it and overcome it at that time? And you don't have to name names, but it would be, I think, interesting for people to hear how you approached that type of an issue.
Go
You
ahead,
want to
Jill.
go first, Christie? Because
No, you go ahead.
Well, I'd say the first, and well, the book has two themes, and one of them is the hurdles that I faced and overcame. So there are many examples, but I will say that for every example there are a dozen that would have served the same purpose that aren't in there. And what I learned is that every obstacle has a different solution, and that you have to keep in mind, are you trying to make a point, or are you trying to advance an objective? So, for example, when I wanted to eliminate the Women's Army Corps, when I was General Counsel of the Army, I knew that if I was...
You should explain why you wanted to do that, because that might sound odd.
Oh, okay. In the Women's Army Corps, there were only two positions for a general, the head of the Women's Army Corps and the head of the Nursing Corps. If women were part of the regular Army, they would be eligible to be any general, to head any fort, to be the Judge Advocate General, any position at all, to be the Chief of Staff, which they couldn't be if they were in the Women's Army Corps, because that was assigned certain jobs. There were also limitations on the occupational specialty that you could fill. And I wanted to open all occupational specialties to anyone who was physically qualified. I mean, if you wanted to be a radio operator, you had to be able to walk a certain distance carrying 100 pounds. There are men who can't, and there are women who can. And I thought that if a woman could do it, she should be able to be a radio operator. So, but to some extent, it was more helpful to me to ask a man to be the spokesman. I would do all the preparation. I would get everything done. But if it's for example, the assistant secretary of personnel, if he's the spokesman, it's an HR issue. If I'm the spokesman, it's a woman's issue. And so you have to keep in mind, am I making a point or do I want to win? When I started trying cases, the word Ms. as a title became available. And I had to debate, do I call myself Ms. or Mrs.? And I opted for Mrs. because I didn't want the jury to think that I was an uppity feminist, which in those days would have been a negative. My job was to have them trust me so that I could present a compelling case and have them vote the way I was asking them to. So I went with Mrs. So there are trade-offs in the sexism you face. Sometimes you have to speak up, as eventually I did at Justice, as I did with Rick. And when I was at Motorola, I encountered a horrible episode of sexism where I was not invited to senior staff meetings, even though I was part of senior staff. And I went to my boss and he said, well, the guys aren't ready for a woman at these meetings. And I felt I needed to enlist him in solving this. So I said, well, what are you doing to help solve that? And I enlisted him as my supporter in this effort rather than saying, you jerk, I'm part of senior staff and I'm coming to the next meeting, which would have not, I think, been successful in terms of my career at Motorola, which I have to thank Christie for introducing me to the CEO, which is how I, through networking, was able to latch on to one of the best jobs of my life at Motorola. So the answer is you have to deal with it. You can't ignore it or it won't go away. But how you deal with it may be through humor. It may be through saying, stop it. And, that's it. I had an episode of sexual assault. I will leave the names quite on into my career. And the HR department found out about it because someone who saw it reported it. And they called me to say, did I want to file charges? And I said, I love my job. I will never be in a position where I'm sitting anywhere near the person involved. I can avoid him. And no, I'm not, because I will lose this. I may win the case, but it's not going to help my career at where I was. So again, I think each one deserves a different answer.
I think Jill makes a super important point about not just dealing with sexism, but really in a broader sense about managing relationships and managing situations. And that is that developing, in effect, a toolbox that you can draw upon so that when humor works, you know how to apply humor. When forcefulness and unwillingness to back down is there, you have the courage and the spine to stand up for yourself. When being a little bit more strategic and playing the long game works, you know how to do that. When enlisting supporters, you know how to do that. Because I think that in any situation, if you feel you're not being taken seriously enough, you need to think through what the dynamic is that's going to be most effective for you. And ultimately, I do believe, and it's what I've observed in my own life, is that you keep doing your best work with the confidence that the vast majority of people will take you seriously and will judge you based on the quality of your work.
That's great. Thank you both for that talk. Christie, did you have something you wanted to?
I think my last question for Jill, just because we've talked a little bit about libraries, which I wanted to make sure we did because that is what brings us together. But the other thing that brings us together is Chicago. And, we've just seen the most recent census report. And the fact is that Illinois has lost population over the last 10 years. There's a lot of talk about the challenges for Chicago as a business community, as a tech community, as a community of inequities. And you, Jill, have obviously lived different places. You went to school in New York, you lived in Washington, D.C., you and Michael lived in Florida for a while, and yet you choose to stay here in Chicago. So I thought we might just close with your sharing a little bit of what to you represents the strength and appeal of Chicago.
Chicago is to me one of the most wonderful cities, and I have traveled. I did international work for many years at Motorola and Maytag, and have lived or spent considerable time in many countries and many wonderful cities. But Chicago really is special. Not just the lakefront, not just the architecture, not just the theater, the ballet, the opera, the symphony, the people. Um, I just think it's a special place. But I got a pin today in the mail that was custom made for me. And I'm going to show it because, in some ways, this is Chicago. And I say that because
because we don't take ourselves too seriously.
No, but and I have to. Transit Tees made this for me, so thank you, Transit Tees. It arrived today. When I wanted to wear something, I was doing a Netflix show about the trial of the Chicago 7. So I wanted to wear something Chicago. And to me, but the original pin was a little teeny thing that I couldn't wear because it wasn't visible. So they custom made this for me. And when I used to fly here in all the years that I lived away from Chicago, my parents would pick me up at the airport. And the first stop was for a Vienna hot dog. And I loved Vienna hot dogs. It was just a big thing for me. So in some ways, maybe that's Chicago, but so is Hubbard Street Dance and the Joffrey and just so many things that I love in this city. And I have to mention the library because it's through the library. I went to Graham Stewart, which was on Broadway, and the little neighborhood library across the street from the school on Broadway was where I discovered books and the world outside of Chicago, outside of my family, outside of myself, but introduced to characters and, even things like Sherry Ames, student nurse, and Nancy Drew, who were, that was considered a role model back then. Now, of course, I think memoirs and biographies are the best way to have role models, but it's through the library. And so, Craig, I want to thank you for hosting this and the Chicago Public Library for existing. You're wonderful, and I appreciate you. And I know it was only a week ago that was Library Week. So congratulations on Library Week.
Thanks so very much, Craig. And Jill, thank you so very much.
And, I really hate to close this program because it's been such a warm and wonderful experience for me and I'm sure our viewers. Thanks again to Jill Wine and Christie Hefner for being here to discuss the Watergate Girl. To our viewers, please know you can check out a copy from the Chicago Public Library or visit one of Chicago's many bookstores, hopefully an independent bookstore, where you can purchase a copy. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube page, so if you have friends who were not able to join us, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public Library website for lots of upcoming virtual events at chicagopubliclibrary.org. Thanks again, everyone, for being here with us, and a special thanks to the library's technical, marketing teams, and the Chicago Public Library Foundation. Thanks again, and have a great night to all.